Spring is here, and the shopping list is long. Time to make a Lowe's run. Buy 3 bags, get 3 free of Stay Green 1 cubic foot garden soil. Plus, right now, members can earn 4 times the points on an eligible purchase. Start spring off strong with these deals and more. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 3/25 while supplies last. Soil offer excludes Alaska and Hawaii. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. See Lowe's.com/terms for details. Subject to change. Point boosters subject to exclusions and more terms apply. One-time only offer.
TaxAct understands you haven't memorized the tax code. That's why TaxAct has live experts to help. TaxAct can even do it for you if you prefer. It's the easiest way to know you're doing it right. Well, other than going back to college and obtaining a bachelor's degree in accounting with a minor in finance, then interning somewhere and becoming fluent in all tax forms. But that might be hard to accomplish before tax day. So maybe just stick with TaxAct. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Russ Gifford. Welcome back to the show, Russ.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Some folks might remember that Russ was on the show earlier this year, and I am happy to have him back on once again. But before we do get going with what we have to talk about this week, another host some folks have been asking about is the original Politics Guys co-host, Jay Carson. Jay has just recently let me know that he does hope to be back on the show sometime fairly soon. He's got an incredibly hectic work life, but he is looking forward to coming back, and I am looking forward to doing the show with him again. So there's your Jay update. One other thing, before we get started, I want to let folks know about another podcast I think you might like. You know, red and blue states, sometimes they seem so far apart, they might as well be different countries like post-World War II East and West Germany. And if you feel that way too, check out the Signal Award-winning podcast, The Future of a Former Democracy, from our friends at More Equitable Democracy. Back for a brand new season, the show examines what the U.S. can learn from Germany's political history, including how the aftermath of Nazi Germany shaped a more resilient democratic system and what that might mean for America's current challenges. Co-hosted by Heather Villanueva and Colin Cole, the podcast blends sound-rich history and contemporary analysis to explore how lessons from Nazi Germany shaped the resilient political system and what America's current democratic challenges expose. You can follow The Future of a Former Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. All right, so, now the U.S. and Israel's war in Iran, it's entered its 4th week, and there's been plenty of disruption, but no clear end in sight. To this point, it's been estimated the war has cost at least $12 billion, and now the Pentagon's asking for $200 billion more. And they've reportedly shifted from a dwindling supply of cruise missiles to much more plentiful gravity bombs. And it makes sense because the pace of the attacks is fairly heavy, and the U.S. industrial base simply can't come close to replenishing what's being consumed. And fundamentally, this is a capacity problem. I mean, there's just one plant in Utah that makes all the solid rocket motor fuel and one World War II-era factory in Tennessee that makes the explosives. Also this week, a big development, U.S. National Counterterrorism Director Joe Kent resigned. And Kent was a Green Beret with 11 combat deployments, publicly accused Israel of pressuring Trump into the war. Now, within hours of that, the White House called him a leaker, and the FBI confirmed a pre-existing investigation into Kent. On the domestic front, U.S. gas prices have soared, with the average price for a gallon of gas hitting over $3.91 a gallon as of March 21st, up from just under $3 a gallon a month ago, a pretty big increase. And this isn't just an oil problem either. I mean, 1/3 of the world's fertilizer ships through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's near closure of that choke point during the spring planting season, that could have significant effects on food prices. So, Russ, we've been talking about this war since President Trump started it on the 28th of February, but you haven't had a chance to let everyone know your position on this. How do you feel about President Trump's decision just to go to war with Iran in the first place?
Yeah, so when we got the schedule for the show, I was trying to figure out how I wanted to kind of tackle this issue. And interestingly, I landed on a sort of approach that tries to face up to what this means for our own government and more broadly what it means in terms of how much American support for or against a thing actually matters. And so I've been digging into the data and trying to figure out how to ground myself in it. And I think what it reveals is just kind of how off the tracks this government is in terms of some sort of popular mandate from the people. So when we look at the data, we see that only 40% of Republicans favor the United States initiating an attack on Iran under the current circumstances, which is kind of in stark juxtaposition with the fact that 9 out of 10 self-identifying MAGA, and again, I just find it so interesting here to try to figure out what the plural of MAGA is. 9 out of 10 self-identifying MAGAs, 9 out of 10 self-identifying Make America Great Again's support it. And so, I mean, that's a massive, massive split within the GOP itself. When you see 40% favoring it, just in broadly speaking, amongst Republicans, but 90% of self-identifying MAGA support it. But we know that popularly around the country, 60% um, 60% disapprove of it. Of those, looking at who disapproves of it, 74% of Democrats, 25% of Republicans, and this is all polling data from the University of Maryland's Critical Issues poll. Another interesting number is that 35% of Republicans just don't know. I mean, I think that speaks to the fact that there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of publicized build up to it. I think if you look at it from the perspective of perhaps the uninformed or someone who isn't consuming news 24/7, it didn't really feel like there was a lot of build up to this. And I think that's incredibly problematic in a world without what I would call journalistic integrity. I mean, when we look at how different sources are reporting and priming the issue, we see that the Times of Israel doesn't call it a war, which I think is incredibly important when we consider that there is a lot of hearsay about whether or not there's a lot of hearsay about Israel's role in this. Again, you brought up Joe Kent's resignation um, and the fact that he was willing to go on the record and say Israel pushed us into this. The Times of Israel, which obviously has a tethered interest in reporting this in a favorable light to Israel, doesn't call it a war. They call it a strike. They don't call it a majority. They call it a plurality. Um, and they write that a plurality of Americans support these strikes. Those numbers look to be around 43% in support of and 33% not in support of. And so to me, it's a lot more interesting to not, and this is just me speaking, of course, but it's a lot more interesting to look at how small and seemingly unimportant the average person is in this country in terms of shaping foreign policy, especially when we have a president who seems to just be willing to do whatever it is that he sees fit with a yes man cabinet and, generally speaking, a yes man side of his Congress as well.
Yeah. Well, and certainly in terms of Trump turning more towards foreign policy in his second term, we've seen a lot of that, and that's a common thing we see with presidents because they are a lot less constrained there than they are in domestic policy. And to me, I know some folks think that this is maybe an attempted distraction from the Epstein files. I just think this is President Trump saying, "Listen, this works. Shows strength for the United States. I want to show strength, and things went so well in Venezuela. Let's go ahead and try it again in Iran." And here we are. I got to say, given the fact that he seemed for a while so concerned about inflation and affordability, the effect that this is having on that is really quite striking. And his willingness to say, well, gas prices might just go up for a while. That's not something I necessarily would have.
Yeah. But I mean, I think in terms of actual strategy, right, we also have to look at how this benefits Russia. We know that the Trump administration removed sanctions on the Russian sale of oil. We know that as the cost of oil rises, we know that it's going to benefit the Kremlin. And we also know that now we're not paying attention to what's going on in China with Taiwan. So, I mean, strategically, the decision just seems to be just genuinely all over the place. And again, I think when we take a more critical approach to these issues. And I will say, like, credit where it's due. We do get information about where these strikes are landing. So I mean, of course, we can go out and kill a leader, but when we're bombing schools and killing school children, and that's reported on, how much strength does it show? A, B, what does it show about the psychology of his base when those sorts of things can be so easily circumnavigated and justified? I mean, it seems to be
Yeah.
the same sort of logic that we're applying to Netanyahu and Bibi's government in what I mean to me feels like the wholesale slaughter of Palestinians, the sort of mental
Well, I
gymnastics
think
that
what
are at play.
you know, I think what some folks in MAGA would say is, obviously some folks would just simply say any news that does not agree with our narrative is fake news. But on the bombing of the school and so forth, obviously a horrible tragedy. I think another way to look at it would say is, what is collateral damage and even, directly American lives lost, I believe 13 at this point. That is a horrible thing. That is an awful thing. But the longer term goal of ending a regime that has been horrifically repressive to tens of millions, or really all of the Iranian people, is actually that is worth the short-term sacrifice. I don't think that's a ridiculous on the face of it argument. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, well, I think it's all in I think it's all in how we interpret the issue. I mean, if we were to imagine a world where America weren't the global hegemon and say, I don't know, Kazakhstan were or something potentially absurd like that, and Kazakhstan were to bomb us and say, well, look at the American left, look at the status of trans people in America, or immigrants, or migrants, or enter any other disenfranchised class in this country, and they were to indiscriminately to bomb us, to bomb our schools, to bomb the White House, to do these sorts of things. I think when we apply that sort of thought experiment to our own lives materially, we understand. Even if roles were entirely reversed in this country and it were the right being oppressed, I would probably look at the deaths of my peers and I would say, well, I would rather we do the liberating. I would rather people with some sort of sympathy to the land and the soil and the people within were to do it. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, it should come as no surprise that I'm against regime change. I am. I'm not going to stand on my soapbox and defend Iran or Iran's oppression. Reading recently that Iran has the highest execution rate in the world, which is apparently right after China. So I get it. I understand that side of the argument, but it's not our job. And I think anybody looking at this critically would understand and recognize that that's not why we're doing it. Like that can be the sort of the primed lining that undergirds it, specifically in how we publicize it and how we go about talking about it. But it's one of those things that intuitively we know that's not why we're doing it. There's a plethora of other oppressive regimes in the world that we're not bombing, that we don't talk about, and that allies in the Middle East don't have ties with. I mean, this just seems like we're lengthening the size of America's boot and we're trying to put it back in the Middle East a lot more firmly to establish another presence. And I'm interested in how pulling that rubber band is going to backfire on us.
Yeah, I
Truly.
don't think I hope it won't, but I think the reason why Iran's different, I mean, there certainly are repressive leaders all over the place. We could take our pick and we could be involved in military action, strikes, wars, call them what you want, forever, essentially. But I think what makes Iran different is, number one, they're the third largest oil exporter in the world. And number two, or the third largest proven reserves of oil in the world. Further down in terms of exporting. But number two, they almost have nuclear weapons, but not quite. So I would argue that's a little bit different. But on the regime change point, I think here's where you and I probably differ more fundamentally. Is I'm not against regime change necessarily. And I certainly think if any regime needs to be changed, it's this regime. My problem is that we're not really good at it. We tried it a lot. In the last 100 years, the U.S. has been involved, by my count, in regime change in 18 different countries. Now, most of those are in kind of our own backyard, if you will, but also in other parts of the world as well. And if you take a look at all of those efforts, in most of those cases, we were actually able to successfully destabilize and overthrow the old regime. But where it gets tricky is achieving kind of longer term policy objectives through regime change. So in other words, it's a lot easier to break something, to get out the bad people than get in new people that are better, which makes sense. And if you go by my definition of successful regime change, and of course I have one, right? I'd say it's removing a hostile government, replacing it with one that's stable, that's aligned with U.S. interests, and doesn't produce a worse problem for us within, say, a generation. Well, the only ones that have been successful by that measure, as far as I can tell, are Panama in '89 and Indonesia and Brazil in the mid-'60s. So not a great track record. Whether you're for it or against it, regime change is difficult.
It is, and I also think that the success rate therein kind of reveals exactly what it needs to. But I don't know that the metric for these sorts of things can or ought to be that they are favorable to the U.S. I think especially when we look at contemporary history and what we've done. I mean, what we essentially do is bolster repression in whatever foreign state it is that we're involved in. And let's be real here. 9 times out of 10 throughout history, maybe not recently. I know recently there's been a sort of I guess you could call it an Islamic flair about it, because so much of the work that the US has been doing post Cold War has been in the Middle East, but it's largely against regimes that have been left leaning, right? Even in Venezuela. I mean, we can say what we will about it, but I mean, domestically we do the same thing. We tank leftist movements all the time. And when we do that, inevitably, what we do is we lift up, um, and I hate to use the word bigoted because it's not the correct word, but it's as close as I can get when I'm trying to think fast. But we lift up bigoted, repressive regimes that don't speak to the will of the people, and so they're naturally standing on one leg instead of two. And then and we kind of keep this, it's like Sisyphus rolling the ball up the mountain. I mean, we're gonna have to watch it go right back down again, and we're gonna start at square one, and we're gonna continually make every country in the world despise us. I mean, you don't have to travel very far to ask that many people questions about us, you know? So when it comes to regime change, it's almost deontological to me. It's almost that we have a duty not to intervene. We don't want anyone else meddling in anything that we do. And outside of outright global agreement against another power, I don't see it. I really don't. And maybe that would
Yeah.
change if I were in power. I have to be honest with myself. I live in a world that feels like it is fundamentally opposed to my political leanings. So maybe if I were in power and I felt that my goals and my ideas would be implemented, then maybe I would get it, right? That's the real politic, which is ultimately what this is, but it's not. And I don't think that there's a metric that would prove that any of this is good. I mean, I always just go back to Chile and thinking of innocent people being tossed out of helicopters by a government, upholstered by the American government as the sort of ultimate example of what regime change looks like to me, and the overthrowing of the Allende government.
Yeah.
And you can look at Europe doing the same thing in Africa. I mean, it's these just denying countries self-determination just doesn't feel.
Yeah, I hear you, and I certainly agree that our history in here is, to put it charitably even, checkered. Then I think about, talk about the regimes that don't respect the will of the people. I don't think you could do a better job of not respecting the will of the people than Iran. And again, when to me, I understand, and I am generally speaking against regime change, but there are a certain subset of instances, and I think Iran might almost qualify. I've been sort of on the fence about this, but we'll see. One other thing I wanted to get into is Joe Kent's allegation. He said it's clear we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. And when I heard that, I thought, yes, but, because I think if you say, if the narrative is, well, Donald Trump was conned into starting this war by Netanyahu, I just don't buy that. Certainly, I see it as a factor. I'm sure Israel applied pressure and Trump has this kind of relationship with Netanyahu. But my sense of things is much more than that. As President Trump loves doing big, bold, tough guy things like this. He was emboldened by Venezuela. I don't think he needed much persuading. It's like when, when my wife asked me, do you want another piece of chocolate? It's not like she needs to twist my arm or anything like that. So I don't know what you think about that. I'm not saying that the Israel lobby isn't important, but I do not think it's nearly as important, specifically as a single factor as some people are making it out to be. What are your thoughts on that, Russ?
Oh man, this one's a struggle. I'm gonna get you get scared when you talk about Israeli influence just a little bit. I'm not big enough to be slandered, so it doesn't matter too much. I think you're spot on when when you look at like a sort of constructivist approach to international relations or political science. Trump is again, I don't like to give credit to this guy. I don't like him. I'd love to get into the octagon with him and ask we have Dana White. We can have Dana White put that one on pay-per-view. I'll beat up an old man.
Oh my God.
But he truly, truly is such a mercurial figure. I mean, it's almost a one of one sort of thing to me. You're smarter than I am, but I don't see another figure in American presidential history, at least, that stands out in this sort of way, to where even if you're not in his base, you can almost kind of deny reality for a second because you have to try to figure out where he's coming from, and it really could be one of a billion different things. So it's almost dead on arrival when you think about why he does what he does outside of some sort of investiture in his status or standing, or at least the perception of who he is as a man. I don't want to deny Israeli influence. I think that that's pretty obvious, even from just the general standpoint of they're kind of our sole ally in the Middle East. They're also expanding their operations in the Middle East, in Lebanon. So would I be surprised? I guess this is the best way to word it. Would I be surprised if there was a lot of pressure from Israel or the Israeli lobby to kind of speed up this strike? Because again, it gets me back to this. It did not feel like there was a lot of buildup. And maybe that's a question I'd pose to you. I'm not saying it was out of nowhere. I'm not at all saying that. But even when you talk about, Trump's comparing this strike to Pearl Harbor, right? He's talking
Yeah.
to the Japanese prime minister, and he essentially compared it to Pearl Harbor. So it didn't feel like there was a lot of buildup to this. It seemed like it was out of nowhere. And I think there's got to be something there for a member of his cabinet to go out on a limb and resign and say that is well, I want to clarify that I don't think it's anti-Semitic in any terms. I think this man had information that neither you or I have.
Sure.
But
Let's
I
hope
think
so.
it's a mark of integrity, but I also think it points to this yes man cabinet. We saw it in the first administration, this sort of carousel that his cabinets have. And it's a mark of integrity for somebody who also in 2020, I don't know if you've seen Joe Kent's previous tweets, but he was begging Trump to go to war with Iran. So, um,
Yeah.
I don't know, but I do think that Israel has a vested interest in getting America involved and
Of
getting
course.
in
Sure.
increasing the size of America's involvement in the Middle East. So I'm not going to speak as if I have all of the
Yeah.
facts, but I'm happy to say that I would not be surprised in the slightest if this was largely Israel's bidding. And I think, again, the data also looks like that. So when you look at the data, 22% of Democrats think it was in Israel's interest. Only 32% of Democrats think it was in our interest. Roughly only three times more Republicans think that it was in our interest versus Israel. So um, those numbers
Yeah.
pale in compare. The number of people who think that it was in Iran's interest or another Arab nation's interest or even other um, pales in comparison. So I think a large amount of the American people also feel this way, which um, kind of maybe
Well,
signals the fact that a lot of people are getting a lot more skeptical of Israeli influence in American politics, for better or for worse.
yeah, I don't think it has to be one or the other. Certainly, I think a different regime, a better regime, and almost any regime would be better than the current one in Iran would be both in Israel's and the United States' interest, and heck, Saudi Arabia's interest, and a bunch of other interests. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I found it interesting that President Trump is upset that other NATO countries won't help him open the Strait of Hormuz when
Yeah.
after he launched the war without consulting with them or informing them, and now he sort of expects everyone to jump in to assist. And my first thought was, well, if they're going to be Trumpian about it, they should say, well, if you want to pay us to kind of bring ships and so forth in. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, he it was also it wasn't a backhanded compliment because it wasn't a compliment, but I was listening to him and I think verbatim he said something along the lines of, "We don't need them, but it would have been nice,"
sure.
and it's so funny. I don't know. It's hard to not try to find the humor in
Uh,
political theater sometimes, and
I
having a reality TV star for a president
Yeah.
definitely helps speed up that process.
You've been there, settling in for an evening of TV only to waste half the night scrolling. Enter Fire TV, entertainment with zero effort required. Fire TV serves up personalized recommendations from across all your apps. Not sure what to watch? Just tell Alexa Plus what you're in the mood for and she'll pull up the perfect recommendation. Problem solved. Stop the scroll, start the show. Find what you're looking for with Fire TV. Subscriptions may be required.
Protein is now at Starbucks, and it's never tasted so good. You can add protein cold foam to your favorite drink or try one of our new protein lattes or matcha. Try it today at Starbucks.
I mean, I am concerned, and I think a lot of people are concerned about all the Marines being sent over there, and potential use of ground troops, perhaps to take that Carg Island facility and try to open in attempts to open up the Strait of Hormuz there. I do not think that the president will end up using ground troops. I think that he's smart to not rule it out because he wants to keep his options open. But to me, that's very much going to be a red line. And the only way I could see him doing that would be as if he were almost 100% assured that it would be a incredibly short, swift, and successful operation. But maybe he's thinking that ground troops could go in and do the same sort of thing that they did in Venezuela, just with taking that particular island. I don't know, but I'm hoping it doesn't come to that for sure. And I'm sure you feel the same way about that.
I mean, I don't want to see any young American man die over a war that I personally feel is meaningly pointless, and I don't want I don't want an American to die at all. To be honest,
Sure.
like even if this were, in my opinion, a purely justifiable thing, I would not cheer that on. And
Yeah.
so, Trump's own comments on even that some people are going to have to die to me are incredibly callous and heartless, but it's what we've come to expect. Um, but it's interesting, yeah, you would be in that 35% of people who don't think that they will be deployed, but you'd also be in the 93% of people who would disapprove of it.
Yeah.
So we'll see if your opinion matters.
Well, I guess when you say he's saying that some people have to die is callous, I see that, but I also think another way to look at it is he's being honest. Is when we pursue various foreign policy objectives, when we decide to do it through military action, there's always that possibility, and of course with ground troops that raises it even more. And so far the death toll for U.S. has been, I believe, 13, obviously much higher on the Iranian side. And that I think it's good that we acknowledge that there is a human cost on both sides to this, and it's always important to weigh that cost. And the other thing I wanted to talk about here is China. Because when I'm thinking about the message that this sends to China, which of course is Iran's biggest consumer, something like over 90% of their oil, I think, well, on the one hand, maybe this makes Xi more cautious about any plans to try to take Taiwan because Trump is simply too, in the word you use, mercurial and unpredictable to know how he'll react. But then again, maybe our depleted arsenal will make Xi more likely to push for taking Taiwan before we really have the capacity to ramp things up in the way, the years that it would take to kind of have enough to really defend Taiwan, especially for things like interceptor standoff devices, because we're unlikely, if something pops off in Taiwan over the Taiwan Strait, we're unlikely to get the sort of quick air superiority there that we got very quickly in Iran. So I don't know what you think about what this says to China, but I'm interested in getting your thoughts on that, Russ.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it does. I think it absolutely directly benefits China. I mean, I think that when a power is stretched, that's when you know, that's when you pounce. So, I mean, I know I've spoken to you personally slash privately. Privately doesn't sound right. I've spoken to you personally about my own. I've been digging deep into the history of Ireland as of late, and we know that a lot of Irish political activity, particularly of the violent variant, occurred when when Britain was being stretched in world wars. And I'm not calling Iran a world war. I'm not doing that. That'd be silly. There's obviously a massive scale difference. But the same sort of logic applies in terms of how much war at once could the American public actually take? How many if we were to simultaneously be in Iran and in Taiwan at the same time, I think the pushback would be I don't think it would be nearly as bad with China because a lot of Americans have, inbuilt biases against that sort of thing. They hear communist and they freak out. But yeah, no, I think it naturally benefits. It obviously naturally benefits China. Like I said earlier, it also benefits Russia. I mean, the cost of oil rising is going to benefit those who are holding it. And yeah, so I mean, when it comes to Taiwan, just in general, I mean, I don't really I don't really feel the need to I don't want to say take a stance on it. I mean, it could probably be assumed how I feel about the Chinese and Taiwan relationship, but yeah, no,
All right.
I think it absolutely outright benefits China, and I don't think that those concerns are probably being handled properly. I don't get the feeling that they are. I don't personally get the feeling that any of what we are currently doing in Iran has been planned out properly. I mean, even the spillover effect of, again, public support for it, public pushback against it. I think that's part of why we see Trump taking such a zero sum approach to how he speaks about it. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to hear yeah, and I understand where you're coming from with it being necessary to kind of verbally express the fact that yes, some Americans will die, but we don't get to ignore the fact that you're making those decisions that put those Americans in positions where they might die.
Sure.
And
Public steps
I
there.
think that's vital. I think that's vitally important to understand that, well, yeah, they have to die if you put them in those positions, but if we never put them in those positions, then they don't. And I mean, maybe it's a little closer to home, but 6 of those Americans who died are Kentuckians. And, that there's no word other than that sucks. That sucks. These were people that were probably in high school around the same time as I was. And I know one was a mother who was about to come home. And I think these people deserve to be humanized when they die due to conflicts caused by people who don't have our interests in mind. I don't think our interests are in Iran. I don't think they were in Afghanistan. I don't think our interests are really anywhere in the Middle East, if I'm being honest. And for even one American to die in a war that doesn't benefit us is a tragedy. Nothing short of a tragedy, I think.
All right. Well, we definitely have a fundamental difference in terms of how we see America's role in the world and foreign involvement. And we will certainly will be talking much more about Iran. But why don't we leave it there for now so we can move on to some other things, like, for instance, I don't know, there was a primary elections in Illinois this last week, and I think the results may say as much about divisions, fall lines in the Democratic Party than they do about, what's going to happen in November. We have Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton, who won the Democratic Senate primary, defeated a congressman who outspent her by more than $20 million with help from Governor Pritzker, who bankrolled a super PAC that poured almost $15 million into the race. And Stratton ran on a pretty progressive agenda: Medicare for all, a $25 an hour minimum wage, abolishing ICE. And she also says, by the way, that she will not back Chuck Schumer for a Democratic leader in the Senate. Now, in the 4 open house races in the Chicago area, outside groups, mainly AIPAC-linked PACs and the crypto industry, spent more than $50 million. This is in primary elections. And the results, well, they were kind of mixed. AIPAC's preferred candidates won 2 races, but in the 2 districts where AIPAC spent the most, its candidates lost. And in the 9th district, the pro-Israel lobby tried to manipulate the field by attacking candidates from the left using shell PACs with names like Chicago Progressive Partnership. Now, their candidate finished 3rd, but the candidate they least wanted to win the nomination, 26-year-old progressive Palestinian-American activist Kat Abu-Ghazala, she narrowly lost to Evanston Mayor Daniel. Now, a progressive scored a big win with Stratton over moderate Raja Krishnamurthy. No progressive candidate came out on top in any of the House primaries. And the biggest winner of the night really wasn't on the ballot. I'd say it was Governor Pritzker. I mean, he installed his running mate as the Senate nominee and almost certain general election winner, given we're talking about Illinois. He ran unopposed for a 3rd term, and he's setting himself up, I think, as a top-tier contender for his party's 2028 presidential nomination. And Republican turnout was low, which is to be expected given the lack of competitive races on the Republican side here. Darren Bailey won the gubernatorial nomination again, and he's the same person who Pritzker beat by 13 points in 2022. So, Russ, let's start by talking about AIPAC's influence in these primaries. I mean, what's your take on what they were trying to do and how AIPAC's positions now play within the Democratic mainstream?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the outright answer is that I absolutely deplore it. And I think this is just me coming from more of a grassroots. I mean, progressive isn't the right word for me, unfortunately, but it should come without saying that I'm going to support progressive candidates when my options are limited. AIPAC's strategy seems to be a bottleneck these elections and to limit our options, which is obvious. That's what lobbying groups want to do, and I do want to hold them in a fair light, so long as they're legally allowed to spend, for instance, $22 million in primary elections, which is just outlandish. I mean, that is ridiculous to think about. But I mean, they want to bottleneck our options. I mean, if they can tank progressives in the primaries, then when it comes to the general, you can't really vote for anybody else, right? So, however, their strategy being fall in line and be unequivocally and explicitly pro-Israel, or we're going to come after you. Moving forward, I think it's a terrible, terrible idea following October 7th, following what we've seen with Israel, following declining support for Israel. There's been a 24% drop in support for Israel in terms of where American sympathies lie. For the first time since this data has been collected, more Americans hold sympathies for Palestinians than Israelis. So those sorts of connections and those sorts of talking points, I think, are going to, in the next half decade, start to fall on deaf ears. So, I mean, we saw it they were coming after Daniel Biss basically up until the last 2 weeks of the primary, which made that a much closer election. And also, it's important to note, Daniel Biss is the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, right? So,
and he calls himself a Zionist. So, yeah, I mean,
yeah. So they're not all over the place. They know what they're doing. They want explicit and unequivocal blank check support for Israel, which I think we're getting to a point where when you give the average American those sorts of options, the average American now cares about this issue in a way that I don't think they did 15 to 20 years ago. I think it used to be more of a, not necessarily a niche, but not necessarily a mainline evangelical thing either, but it used to be a very evangelical position, right? Like, I mean, those who have a belief in premillennial dispensationalism and the idea that Christ is going to come back to Israel. Like, it used to be that those were the sorts of people who cared deeply about this issue. And if you care deeply about it and you a mainline evangelical, you were honestly probably some sort of member of the left who really cared about Palestinian resistance and oppression and their liberation
Yeah.
movements.
And
And
certainly,
now it's a very mainstream thing now, and so I don't see this benefiting them in the long run, but I also think that they're changing their strategy in terms of they lost elections in New Jersey because of it. They come into Illinois, they kind of come off the pedal and they go after Abu Gonzala a little late, and hopefully that as a leftist it signals, I can have faith that these candidates are doing better at the poll as time goes on,
yeah.
but
A number of outlets sort of painted this as a wipeout for progressive candidates and saying, listen, progressives just can't win. You need more centers. But that doesn't explain Stratton, like I said, who clearly was the most important primary. Stratton's unquestionably a progressive. And so to me, when I look at these results, I say, well, no, to me, this says more that maybe voters prefer what I'll call pragmatic progressives over what I'll call performative progressives, or maybe even more than that, is that the people I'm calling pragmatic progressives are progressives who have managed to get a certain amount of institutional support within the party, as opposed like this, as opposed to like an Abu Gonzalez who, just is outside of that Democratic establishment, even that sort of further left part of it. And so I don't really see this as a huge wipeout for progressives. I don't know how you feel about that, Russ.
I don't see it as a wipeout for progressives whatsoever, and I think that's partly due to my participation in these movements for so long. I mean, I'm 26 years old. I've been a member of the broader American left coalition for essentially my entire adult life, or give or take 8 years. And I mean, these narrow defeats are something that we're used to. And I don't think that metrics or numbers are something that I'm willing to concern myself with too much, because on the ground, and maybe this is me getting back too deep into my roots, but experientially or phenomenologically speaking, you can tell a difference amongst the youth and people my age when we talk about these things. So being able to promote or get a leftist political commentator as the runner up in a relatively significant election is of sizable importance. It's very, very important. And when you see people who in 2024 might have been vote blue no matter who sorts of people, blue MAGA, as I've
Hmm.
heard some other people call it. And I actually really like that. Blue MAGA is a good term. I think we should take both sides pretty seriously in terms of their intransigence when it comes to supporting outsiders. Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it in that sort of light at all. I think the left is gaining steam. And I think that a lot of that, or the vitality of that movement is occurring outside of the poll. And it's occurring in places that you can't measure. And so when it comes to elections, that's something that we're used to.
Yeah.
And that truly feels like something that could change overnight. I mean, again, we can cite Mamdani, right? Nobody 3 years ago would have expected what we've had with Mamdani. And I think the man has had
Yeah.
great political successes, and that's beside the point. It's an aside. But to speak of these movements in more general terms, I don't think that there's anything
Yeah.
necessarily to fear. These movements don't have the money backing them. They don't. They depend on grassroots support, and that's always going to be an uphill battle. But if the kettle is struck when it's hot, then we know what can happen.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is it's harder to win a primary if you're focused on the sort of younger progressive voters that someone like an Abu Gonzalez would really appeal to a lot. You take a look just in the Chicago area for this election, that's where most of the action was. I mean, under 5% of voters were 18 to 24, and only around 20% were under 35. So when your electorate skews that much older, that makes it even harder, not even to mention the lack of institutional support and that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is Pritzker. It was a good election primary for him, even though he wasn't a candidate. But to me, I've heard a lot of talk about him being potentially at the top rank of Democratic candidates. I don't really buy it. I mean, this is a very visual medium now. He doesn't look the part. I think his billionaire status, but I mean, truthfully,
I'm not laughing at you, but in my head, I was thinking the same exact thing, but I was asking myself if it was appropriate to
No,
say.
I mean,
I'm glad you did first.
it's the truth of the matter, I mean, and not only that, but he's a billionaire, which I got to say in the Democratic circles would I think not necessarily play all that well. And also he comes from a deep blue state that Republicans haven't won at the presidential level in nearly 40 years. So I don't really see him as being a great choice for the Democrats, but I'm no longer a Democrat. I'll let you kind of, what do you think about Pritzker in the scheme of things here?
I'm not a Democrat either, but then again, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't even remember how I registered to vote. So
Okay.
presumably I did register as a Democrat. I like Pritzker. I enjoy what he's doing. I enjoy the stances that he's been willing to take. But if I'm being honest, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, and to go back, I do agree with you on the visual thing. I think I would love to. I need to read more about that. I know it's like we don't really ever have like a short president. We need like a 5'4", really skinny little dude president. We will probably never have one, and that's funny. But Pritzker, for some reason, reminds me a lot of John Fetterman. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know if you remember the Fetterman, the run up to his race in the Senate, and him getting in and him winning that election. And then we have this all the time, obviously, where a candidate before they're elected is as enormously different from the candidate that they are once elected, right? Like that's normal. You lie to get into office. You might be braggadocious or humble, and then you get in office and whatnot. But I can't put my thumb on it. He reminds me of John Fetterman a lot. I think he seems the sort of opportunist who would get into office and then or get into federal office, that is, um, and then have a 180-degree turn. I think we see this a lot with Democrats in blue states. It's why, I don't have any faith in someone like Andy Bashir, right? Like I don't have any faith in someone like Pritzker. Um,
Sure.
I don't, and I know he's taken some really really heavy stances. I was reading recently about some of the stuff he's had to say about APAC, and he was obviously somewhat militant about what was it, Operation Midway Storm or whatever the Trump administration decided to call their Operation Midway Blitz
Hmm.
with ICE. But I mean, those sorts of stances have to be taken kind of tongue in cheek because you have to do that, right? It's a political necessity for you to not be silent when federal agents
Sure.
are disappearing people in your communities. So,
Yeah.
is it a win? I mean, it's a win if you want progressives to be elected. I don't know if the Democratic Party sees it as a win. I don't know
Yeah.
if the average Democrat sees it as a win, but I mean, if it was a genuine thing that he set out to do on his own accord, then yeah, it's a win for him. And I mean, when you're the governor of a state, you should absolutely wield the influence that you have. And I think it's important, and it signals to him that his base or his supporters clearly have hold some
Yeah.
level of efficacy in him.
I just think the Republicans would love to see Pritzker as a nominee. I mean, I could see, you take a look at the state of Illinois. I mean, tax hikes, slow growth, population outmigration. I mean, the sort of Republican ads, he'll do to America what he did to Illinois. The ads practically write themselves. Kind of a similar ad where you could do the same kind of ads for Gavin Newsom, who I dislike for other reasons. But
Oh, I mean, don't get me started on Gavin Newsom.
all right. Well, let's move off of that. But before we get to our next thing, just a quick message. When my gut is off, everything feels off. My digestion, my energy, even my mood and my focus. And every day your gut, it's fighting a silent war against processed foods, stress, even toxins in the air. And when your gut struggles, your whole body feels it. And most probiotics never make it to your gut alive, which is why they don't work. But Just Thrive, it's clinically proven to arrive 100% alive and deliver measurable results. Just Thrive turns your gut into an antioxidant factory, creating protective compounds exactly where you need them most. That means benefits like better digestion, healthy immunity, more energy, and easier weight management. And Just Thrive Probiotic comes in capsules or berry-flavored gummies, so there's an option for everyone in the family. For over a decade, Just Thrive has been helping thousands of people take control of their health with science-backed solutions you can trust. For their award-winning probiotic to their full line of gut, immune, and brain health supplements, Just Drive is ready to help you live your healthiest life. You can try Just Drive probiotic for 90 days risk-free, and you can save 20% on your first order with code CX. See the difference for yourself or get a full product refund, no questions asked. Take the 90-day Just Drive probiotic challenge today at justdrivehealth.com/CX. Be the best you with Just Thrive. All right, so, Russ, this week the Senate, they opened a potential floor fight over the SAVE Act. This is a bill that would require every American to prove their citizenship with a passport or birth certificate to register to vote, show photo ID to cast a ballot, mandate ongoing voter roll purges in all states, and require states to share their voter rolls with the Department of Homeland Security. It also would impose criminal penalties on election officials who register ineligible applicants, even if the election official made an unintentional administrative error. And it would create a private right of action that would allow any individual to sue an election official for alleged noncompliance. Now, this measure passed the House in a 218 to 213 vote back in February, with Republicans voting unanimously in favor and all but one Democrat opposing the bill. The vote to begin debate in the Senate was 51 to 48. Now, there's essentially no chance that it gets the 60 votes it needs to overcome a certain Democratic filibuster. So, why is this happening? Well, President Trump declared the SAVE Act his number one legislative priority and threatened to refuse to sign any other bill until it passes, telling House Republicans that it would guarantee the midterms. And, I think for John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, the floor debate on this is at least a pressure valve. It lets MAGA senators kind of vent. It forces Democrats to cast potentially uncomfortable votes against voter ID, which tends to poll well, and it buys time before maybe bigger legislative fights this year. But Russ, what do you think about this legislation, which, even if it doesn't pass at the federal level, is actually in the works in a similar form in nearly a dozen Republican-led states?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and man, it's so fun to try to word these things from the perspective of someone who does care about American politics, but who's, naturally as a Marxist, my worldview is more global. I was talking to someone the other day, and voting is almost. I will go out on a limb, and I will say voting is currently somewhat too easy.
Wow. Okay.
I know that sounds crazy, and maybe this is. I like to have a little bit of nuance, a little bit of spice, but you go to a poll. This is my name. My name is Russ Gifford. They scan me. They don't scan me. They scan a paper. They find my name. You're good to go. And I've always wondered about how or why that's so easy in terms of it's a lot easier to vote than it was for me to change my address. And I say that as someone who's more so frustrated with the state of Indiana as I've moved, and they made changing my address very difficult. And so I think that voting integrity is incredibly important. But I think it's a burden that should be placed entirely, and 100%, not 99.9, not 99.99999, but 100% upon the government. And the SAVE Act obviously does not do that. The responsibility is placed entirely on citizens and not the government. And I don't think that there's a way to read this bill without seeing it as a poll tax. And I don't know if there's a way to look at it without considering it as a poll tax. 29 million voting age Americans don't have a driver's license. I was looking at some data that surprised the living hell out of me. An additional 7 million don't have any form of photo identification whatsoever. And so when we know that, and I didn't write this down, I didn't take a note on it, but a bunch of these states don't have IDs that are compliant with what it would take to be able to vote. And so you're going to need a passport. And so you're looking at about $200 some odd to get a passport plus 4 weeks. And so you're making voting this cumbersome affair, which I'll be honest with you, as somebody who rarely am I sort of cudgeled into a position where I want to vote. I do it begrudgingly, but it's very hard to motivate me to vote. I can tell you right now that if I weren't a privileged white dude with very little to worry about who already had a passport and a real ID and all these other, to me, they're really just trinkets of bureaucracy. If I didn't already have those, I'm telling you right now, I understand myself enough to say I wouldn't vote. If you told me that I had to go get a passport or I had to get an additional form of identification to vote, or I had to bring, and this is the other layer, right? You have to have a birth certificate with your name on it. So if you don't have your birth certificate, you're in big trouble. Or if you're married, if you're a woman who's married and changed your last name, or you've hyphenated your name, now you're in a and what is it? This is like the fourth layer of electoral hell. And so the fundamental problem is that it places the burden entirely on the shoulders of the voter. Voting should be something that's handled federally by the government. It should be something where every step of the way to vote, I think, should be that the entirety of that burden should be shouldered by those responsible for tallying the votes, and it's not. And the federal government isn't allocating any funds for states to implement these things. And so it gets me back to this. One of the easiest things to read about Donald Trump is how mad he gets or how slighted he feels when he loses something. And we look back to him losing to Joe Biden and his approach to mail-in ballots and his approach to voting and his efforts and attempts to make that election look like it was stolen from him. And I think that this bill just rides the coattails of that.
Yeah.
You know, who does this bill really affect? Well, it affects non-white people who are more likely to not have these licenses. The lion's share of those, I think it's something like 18 million of those people don't have a high school degree or only have a high school degree. And then the lion's share of that make less than $30,000. In effect, you're adding yet another hurdle for these people to jump through. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to guess who already disenfranchised people generally are going to want to vote for. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, you know, to me, it's a poll tax. Not to continue rambling on and not let the doctor in the room talk, but you know, again, I've been getting really into data, looking at this stuff, and from 1992 to 2022, there were 1,634 cases of attempted non-citizen votes in the state of Georgia. Every single one of those was blocked. In 2024, 20 out of 8.2 million voters were removed. They were removed before they could vote. So these processes, even in red states, already worked. The Heritage Foundation, which is one of the most trusted conservative think tanks that I can come up with, or that I can, and I say trusted in air quotes, of course. You know, I want nothing to do with them, but conservatives trust them a lot. Suspects that only 99 cases of non-citizen voting have occurred going back the last 26 years. So it's one of those, call me a technocrat, call me whatever you want. I'll go against my own intuition when I say voting is too easy. But when the smart people in the room, some of whom are conservative and who in a maybe not an ideal world, but in a world that made sense would support this bill, are telling you that 99 votes out of over probably 1 billion in 26 years across all elections have been from non-citizen voters. When everybody in the room's telling you it's a non-starter, it feels like a non-starter. And yeah, it's aggravating. Even if someone who feels like voting doesn't matter that much, it's incredibly aggravating.
Well, of course, President Trump knows that this won't pass, but when it does fail, and Democrats, as I assume they will, do well in the midterms, this allows him to claim, that massively unauthorized immigrant voting rigged the election for Democrats, wouldn't do anything against it. So he might as well say this. It reminds me in a way where it was former Senator Ben Sass of Republican from Nebraska. In the wake of the 2020 presidential election, he said, right now we're locked in a destructive, vicious cycle. Step one is allege widespread voter fraud. Step two, fail to offer specific evidence. Step three, demand investigations on grounds that there are allegations of voter fraud. I mean, this has sort of been the playbook for years now. And so it's pretty clear what's going on here. And of course, it's not technically disenfranchising voters. It's just adding enough friction to kind of make largely Democratic-leaning voters say, I can't be bothered to try to get a birth certificate or something like that. I mean, it's a no-lose proposition for President Trump because he doesn't actually care about the long-term integrity of or threatening, the integrity of our elections by accusing them of being rigged. And so for him, there's no loss to this.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I mean, again, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say the Democrats care about this either, because again, we look at the data and we know that it's not an issue. Democrats are not winning elections because people here, in air quotes, illegally are voting. That's not why they win elections. They win elections because they run in districts that hold constituencies that, by and large, support them. Right? I mean, they probably live in a gerrymandered district. I mean, um, and so that's part of it, surely. But does that not say a lot, either A, about the political programming of this country, or B, the people who support them, when we can say without a shadow of a doubt that that's why these sorts of bills take place, is because we know that it can be argued and then ran on as if Democrats don't want these sorts of things because they want, illegal aliens voting or something. Like, to me, that says everything that we need to know about it.
Sure, yeah. And I guess, yeah, I would actually be in favor. I mean, I would be for photo ID required at registration and during voting if, and this is a huge if enough money and resources, back to your point, were made available to ensure that this wouldn't disproportionately affect low-income minority female voters. But that won't happen because this is not about restoring integrity to voting, because it's not a real problem. It's a perception that was created by Donald Trump and others, and now the solutions to this non-existent problem just magically so happen to help Democrats or help Republicans electorally. So, I mean, yeah, to me, it's very clear what's going on. And even though this won't pass at the federal level, like I said, a number of states are doing this and they're well within their rights to do it. And that certainly is going to give Republicans at least some help, I assume, at the polls. So I wouldn't expect enough so that Democrats don't end up taking a majority in the midterm elections, at least in the House.
But I'm interested in your, like, I guess that's me proposing a question to you and wanting an answer both as your friend and for the audience. If you think that, I don't feel like I'm a particularly smart guy, right? Like, I'm credentialed. I'll give myself that because that can't be denied. But you're a doctor of this stuff. I'm a master of this stuff, which that sounds really funny when you put it that way. But does it not say a lot about the programming of his base if this sort of thing sounds like common sense? Like, it sounds like common sense. We could make a poster with the data on it, and we could easily demonstrate that it's a non-starter. It intrigued me that we're kind of silent on what it says about this country, and this happens in every Western country, right? I'm not saying Americans are dumber than Britain. We can look at polling data about Brexit and all sorts of things. But does it not signal a massive failing in the political literacy of this country that you can run on a sort of thing that just doesn't have any bearing on reality, and it will probably yield some amount or some level of political success?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's, I think, a more widespread thing than just this particular issue, the ability to choose your own facts and choose your own reality and just essentially, at this point, make stuff up and get a significant portion of the American public to believe you. Yeah, that's scarier on a whole different and whole deeper level to me.
Yeah, you gotta get into some Baudrillard, man. I mean, the reality is repressing the real. I'm telling you, it's not. We need to get back to postmodernism. That's what it is, Mike. It's the postmoderns were right, and we just ignored them for too long.
God, yeah, that's a scary thought, and I don't know, maybe on that scary thought, I don't know if I can go on anymore. So maybe we will close on that scary thought. But I am I am really glad that you were here, that we were able to do the show together. And hey, for folks, if there was anything that Russ and I talked about on this episode that you disagreed with, or you have a question about, or you just want to hold forth about, we'd love to hear from you. Our email's mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. And of course, there's our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And as a supporter, you don't just get access to that Discord. You get ad-free versions of everything we release, the full-length midweek episode, instead of just a preview as well. And if supporting us is something you're interested in doing, you can. That would be great. We always put support links in the show notes. But if you can't, you're not in the position to swing financial support right now, but you also would like that full-length midweek show, totally not a problem. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it helps us out tremendously if you subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast app, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producing team. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,